Okay, the next thing we need to talk about is this term percentiles. Essentially what percentiles do is they divide a data set up into 100 equal parts. Percent means out of 100, so percentiles make the data set into 100 equal parts. The percentiles mark that the dividing points in the data set. In other words, the 23rd percentile separates the lower 23% of a data set from the upper 77%. So if we're at the, say, 23rd percentile, here below is 23% of the data, and above is 77% of the data. Likewise, the 86th percentile, so if this whole line represents our entire data set, the 86th percentile would be somewhere up here where we have the percentile always tells you what percent of data is below. So here we have 86% of the data, this is 14% of the data, and whatever is here, that's your 86th percentile. So percentile always tells you the percent of data that is below. Now you've all encountered percentiles. If you remember taking the ACT, you were given a percentile ranking. So perhaps you were ranked in the 92nd percentile for the math portion. That does not mean that you got 92% of the material correct. It simply means that you did better than 92% of the people who took the exam on the same day at the same time as you. See, the entire data set is all those people who took the exam. If you're in the 92nd percentile, then 92% of them fall below you and 8% fall above. Okay. Again, if you were in the 72nd percentile, that means then that 72% of the people scored below you and 28 above. So percentiles always tell us the percent of data below. Now really quick, let's just take a look. Again, if this whole line represents our data set, think about where the median would be. The median would be exactly halfway through the data set. So yes, we call it the median, but if I was to give it a percentile, it would be the 50th percentile. Okay. Now let's talk about a couple of other important percentiles. All right, consider the bottom half of the data. If I was to go from the beginning, okay, so here I am, here's the beginning to the middle, so I'm looking at just this bottom half of the data now. If I was to go from the beginning and halfway through the bottom half, that would put me here, halfway through the bottom half. Well, think about what percent of data is below this dashed line. That is 1/4 of the data, or 25%. This is known as the 25th percentile. A lot of times, instead of calling it the 25th percentile, you may hear it referred to as the lower quartile. And an even shorter notation for that is Q for quarter, Q1. So quartile refers to a quarter, so the lower quartile means there is a quarter or 25% of the data below. We may call it Q1 because there is 1/4 of the data below, okay? But ultimately in terms of percentiles, it's the 25th percentile because 1/4 or 25% of the data is below. Okay, now consider the upper half of the data here, okay? If I go from my median to the end of the data set, halfway through this portion of the data is here. Now think about it, okay? What percent of data is below? Well, you have this 25%, this 25%, and this 25%. That's a total of 75% of the data below. So you may hear this referred to as the 75th percentile. Now this term, upper quartile, which also refers to the 75th percentile, can be a little deceiving. Upper quartile because it sections off the upper quarter of the data from the rest of the data set, but percentiles always deal with the percent of data below. So the 75th percentile has 75% of the data below. The shorthand notation of Q3 probably makes more sense. Q referring to quarters and 3 the fact that there are 1, 2, 3 quarters below. So, couple things. Keep in mind, percentiles always tell you the percent of data below a certain point. The median is the 50th percentile because half the data is below. We have the 25th percentile, which we refer to often as Q1, so 1/4 of the data below. The 75th percentile would have 75% of the data below, and a lot of times we call it Q3 because there are 3/4 below that particular point.